Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic, and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. One of the things that I think would be most supportive for healthy relationships is a sense of the fact that we have no scarcity of people. And as Alison Armstrong says in her work with helping men and women really find the right connections, it's not a scarcity problem, it's a sorting problem. We have a ridiculous number of humans on the planet. There are so very, very, very many people. And when we end up in a relationship where parts of it match and parts of it don't, we can end up really working hard and really pretzeling and really holding on and going away and coming back. And this can apply to a friendship and it can apply to a romantic relationship. And the amount of effort that people put in trying to make something work when it's not being particularly successful versus the amount of effort they put into going out and sorting for other people, like really looking for a more sustainable relationship to build, is often really skewed toward, let me try to make this work. And I'm speaking a bit for myself and some of the clients that I have the most success with. And by that I mean that I'm somebody who loves really deeply, and when I have a soul that I just adore and a deep love for the person in a developed relationship, it's hard. It takes my heart a long time. There's a lot of grief when we have to part ways. And so I work really hard. I'm definitely not the person who, the first time someone triggers me, I'm over it and I'm heading for the hills. And I'm also sharing this from the perspective of someone who's done an enormous amount of inner work. So I'm extremely familiar with my own triggers. And when my little girl wants to take her toys and go home because some past wound has been tripped, it doesn't happen very often, but I'm prepared. I like the Brené Brown, don't talk, don't text, don't type when you're super triggered, because it's not going to go particularly well. And if I'm really, really triggered, I probably need to excuse myself as gracefully as possible and go figure out the reaction. There are not a lot of experiences we have as healthy adult people that are going to trigger us much above a 5 on a scale of 1 to 10. So, there are plenty of things that could be like, yeah, that's authentically not okay with me. But if we get incandescent with rage over something that is a moderate stepping on our toes, once we get skillful, again, you could have some really unhealthy people in your life doing things that really aren't okay with you, and that's a different problem. But assuming you're cultivating reasonably healthy relationships with reasonably healthy people and not letting a lot of stuff build up, that explosion is some kind of emotional debt. It's emotional debt because of what you haven't told the person. So the 27 times you might have put up with something that was not okay with you. It could be that you've told them a bunch of times, but you haven't boundaried or enforced those boundaries. So one of the things I did over and over again, and when I was in my 20s with the man I was with, is I had these long, torturous conversations in and outside of therapy trying to explain how impactful him getting drunk off his ass at a party was, and then being all friendly and warm toward me at the end. And I really didn't like how he changed in the discernment of connection when he was super duper intoxicated. And we had long conversations, and I was so sure if I could just find the perfect words, I would be able to do that. And he would swear upside one side and down the other that never again would he do this drinking thing. And he was just working with some addiction. So, we'd binge drink the next time, and then we'd start the whole process over. And to one degree, it was his lack of health. But for me, I didn't have the skill to enforce. So it wasn't like I was like, all right, I'm going to leave the party and walk away because I'm not going to be with you. I didn't leave the relationship. When it became clear, I kept telling and telling, but I didn't enforce until finally I left the relationship, and I had my own lack of health and complexity that factored into that. But of course, I was angrier each time it happened because of the emotional debt of all the times before. And often we have things that really build up from our childhood or earlier experiences or past relationships. And so one of the things that really factors into this as a whole, regardless of where you are in relationships, is cleaning out the emotional debt. So when you have something that isn't okay with you, you're just having the level that it's not okay with you one time in that moment, not all the wounds that have come before and all the unprocessed information. And so when it comes to, if something isn't working, rather than struggling with it, it's good to step away. It's important to combine the inner work of not being such a reactive and easily triggered person who hasn't dealt with all of that. And we often have that. It takes work to clean that up, and it's never that fun to go clean those closets out of where we're holding on to old, stagnant, painful emotionality that we didn't have the skills to deal with at the time. I talk about some of this in my podcast on sensitivity versus reactivity. So if you want to go deeper with that, that's a good one to listen to start to look at that. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that you're somebody who doesn't just cut ties at the first second that anything goes wrong, and that you're somebody who's done enough inner work that you're not blowing up and having these really disproportional reactions to what actually happened, and you're in a relationship with someone you love deeply, and there's something that truly is a deal breaker for you, that doesn't work for you, that's just not okay, and no amount of pretzeling and adjusting and trying and reasoning and communicating is really going to make this fundamental dynamic okay. Like for me, the guy I was with when I was 20, being a binge drinker around me was just not okay, nor was his gambling addiction. It just didn't work, and there was no amount of I could get healthier or I could adjust myself and have success being in a relationship with someone who had the issues that he had. And I totally had easily as many, if not more, issues than he did. So I don't want to paint an incorrect picture. I was kind of a hot mess and quite unskillful as a young version of myself, which is a lot of stuff that I worked through. But what I specifically want to talk about is the way that we can end up holding on to friendships or romantic relationships that really aren't sustainable. And when something's really sustainable, there's an easefulness. There's what I love to give is what you love to receive, and vice versa. The energy exchange is balanced. There isn't a real codependency where somebody's trying to rescue or save, but also control the other person. There's a communication success. There's an enjoyment of being together. Stephen Covey, in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, talks about the emotional bank account. And when someone's behavior is just not okay with you and not okay with you, you can drain the emotional bank account, and then you're not looking at them with kind assumptions. You're not looking at them with generosity. You're super reactive when they step on your toes because the amount of aggravation exceeds the amount of good feelings that are coming out of a relationship. And what I find really useful to know is that the deep love that I have for someone is a different place that I pull from than the emotional bank account. So the emotional bank account is how much pleasure I get out of the dynamic. And I can love someone profoundly, so deeply, and still have them really working my last nerve and just not be a good person to hang out with, or not be a good person to hang out with when they're intoxicated or in certain circumstances. There are people who I'm like, you are a lovely person, but I do not want to be in a car you're driving because you get really aggressive with other drivers, for example, and that's going to really leave me a stress ball. But I can, it doesn't affect how much I love them. And I think that's a really useful thing to know, because I think we mash together the deep love we have for people and the operating capital of a dynamic that really works in a contemporary way. And we can end up sort of feeding a not very healthy, not very sustainable dynamic out of the deep love we have for someone. And there's a limit to how long that'll work, and it's probably not going to be very fun in the meantime. So why do we end up doing this? Why do we end up struggling so hard? Some of it's if we just don't like grief. I'm not a huge fan of goodbyes. And so when I find a soul that I really love, like I'm like, oh, we've danced together in other lifetimes and you're luminous and I see your beauty and okay, sure, you have an anger management problem. That's a bummer, but I'm so in love with and delighted with your core essence. It can be hard to step away from that, especially when I was a younger person and I just had fewer experiences of the deep soul connection that I can have with people that's pretty independent of how healthy or sane or well balanced they are. It's just different aspects. So I can see the beauty of someone who is functioning poorly enough that they're probably not going to be able to stick with the rules of their parole and keep their freedom, and both can be true at the same time. I know that's an extreme example, but it's important to detach the appreciation and the love and the beauty we have for someone. One of the ways I language the distinction is saying I'm in someone's fan club, and that's really different than saying they're my friend. There are a lot more constraints on who I would call a friend than who I can be in their fan club. Because if I'm in their fan club, it's just about appreciating the beauty of them as a soul and being very much, if we have something that lines up in the moment, that's great. Whereas if they're a friend, I'm actively invested in sustaining, and there are a lot more points of discernment that I need to check off in order to invest time and energy in a relationship that I want to be sustainable. And so one of the things that can happen is we can end up really settling for the people that are around us, really staying immersed with not very healthy people, whether we're talking about your family of origin or a boyfriend that you keep going back to or a girlfriend that you keep circling back to. And I want to talk really specifically about one of the cognitive biases that I believe that we have and where it comes from, so that you can have a little chat with yourself when you feel in your bones that there's no one else who could ever be what this person is. And that's the history of humans. So most of our past lives and most of our ancestors were living in little farming communities, or were living in little hunter-gatherer tribes. And there were a really finite number of humans that could be supported with the amount of land that was available. Like you could not put an infinite number of humans on land. As we've gotten more towards cities with trucking and distribution lines and grocery stores, sure, you can bunch a lot more humans together. But back in the day, there was just a small number of people that you were going to know your whole life, and probably the only new people that were going to come in were going to be babies that got born. And so if you're a teenage girl or a teenage boy looking for a mate, first of all, the numbers might not be balanced, assuming that you were a heterosexual little hunter-gatherer teenager. Even if you weren't, there was just a real finite number of available potential mates, and so you were looking for the very best one. And the competition was really fierce. Like the babies of the better hunter or the more skillful gatherer were going to have a better chance of surviving. The people who were most inclined towards sex were more likely to have more babies. There were these driving factors for our ancestors. And so a lot of the painful competition we see among women or among men is kind of a non-issue in the abundance of the modern world of potential people to pair with and know. But we're kind of biologically hardwired to be in the no, the people who are like, wow, no guy is worth it. I'm not going to let this come between my friendship, may not have become our many times great grandmothers. And so there's this human instinct that says, there's a finite number of people. And so I believe we're cognitively predisposed to not believe that there are other potential people that we haven't met yet. And the reason for that is, so much human experience, so much the experience of our ancestors, of our past lives, of the biology that we were designed for, meant that you probably knew all the humans that were relevant for friendship and mating by the time you were 15 or 20. Lifespans weren't as long as they are today. And, if you were 30, a newborn probably was never going to be meaningful as far as a potential mate. And so these were the people you had to work with. And I think it predisposes us to try to adjust ourselves to align really deeply with the people available and make it work with them and figure it out, because you couldn't really leave your tribe. You couldn't say like, this is not good. I don't love that we're practicing human sacrifice. I'm going to hike over the ridge and see if the tribe over there doesn't kill people. That was a good way to get killed. You're an outsider, you might be here to steal our supplies, game over. So there's all of this sense where we don't really believe the abundance of other people. And a lot of times social connection gets treated like an attribute rather than a skill. And there are people who are just naturally really good with connecting with new people and exploring with new people. And there are other people who that's not such a natural skill set. And one of the things I know, I was so socially awkward and so shy and so energetically overwhelmed as a teenager. And once I learned to manage energetics, so I got some protections and some filters, I literally learned the skill set of connecting with other people. And my self-assessment is I was far below average in my younger years, and I believe I'm quite a bit above average as far as being able to interface with other humans now. There's something that finding rapport and connection across all different varieties of interaction, whether we're talking about the person at the grocery store or someone I have to work with for an insurance claim or the friend of a friend or, someone that I meet on a first date. Like it's not hard for me to connect with another person. I'm still quite introverted, so the amount of hours in a day I want to spend with new people I haven't met yet is a very, very small number, but there's still this skill that's been developed. And so if you're somebody who has a hard time meeting other people, looking at that as something that you could figure out. You could look at the possibilities. I've done a lot of online dating because I'm not particularly receptive to strange men when I'm at Costco. I'm not striking up conversations. I'm mostly trying to kind of tune out the loudness of the grocery store energetically and get my groceries and get home. And doing what I do as a solo entrepreneur, I'm just not meeting a ton of single men in the course of my day-to-day. However, I could be employing other strategies if I chose to spend time in places where single men might be and strike up conversations. It's just that I'm using this other mechanism. And the quote-unquote not meeting anybody when I don't have a profile up, it's like, well, if I'm not having new conversations with lots and lots of people, that whole the perfect person will find you mythology, doesn't seem like it'll work all that well. And so there's a thoughtfulness to saying, okay, I would love to have more friendships and some new friendships. And when I meet people and I have that soul connection and that appreciation, I bookmark it for like, oh, I'm going to explore with them. I'll invite them to spend some time, knowing that more than half the time probably we'll get to know each other a little better and it won't line up. Adults are busy. They might not have time. We might find that as we go a little deeper, there isn't the alignment and the enjoyment. We don't want to do the same things. And I'm not really interested in something that isn't all that easeful. So I'm not attached to the results, but when I meet somebody nifty and who I really like, who feels like they could be a friend, I put some effort into exploring that. And as such, ideally, over time, I can end up with replenishing my social circle as people move out of it or move away or move on to a different chapter of their lives. And one of the things that we can really document in the modern era is that loneliness is potentially worse than smoking a pack a day. It's really, really, really harmful to our longevity, and many people are acutely lonely. And I would argue that it's sort of a modern mechanism of having the option to be really much more disconnected from our neighbors, which as an introvert, I really like the fact that I don't have to interface with people day in and day out, that I don't choose. I have a lot of control and choice over it. but it means that the natural flow of the community, you're not like just naturally going to the barn raising because that's what everybody does, or naturally gathered around the fire because that's what everybody does. There's a need to bridge, and when something doesn't work out, I think that we hold on to unsuccessful relationships way too long because we don't have an awareness of the abundance. We don't have the, okay, I could let go of this. I could do the grief work. I could be really sad that this person I really love doesn't have a way to participate with me in a way that works for me. I can still really totally love them, but it's not smart for me to sleep with them or spend time with them. And so I can come home to myself. And then after I've gone through the grief process, it's a little bit of pulling in, I will free up the time and energy that I could put into developing other potential connections. There's an influencer I really like named Hillary Rushford, and she has some podcast episodes that are great about really breaking down, like, how do you make friends as an adult? How do you cultivate more friendship? And really getting detailed in the nitty-gritty of like what that skill set looks like and how you approach that. And the person who initiates really has a ton of power in this, because personally, I'm a bad initiator, and so they're friends I don't see nearly as often because I have to initiate, because they're worse initiators than I am. And the amount of time it takes me to remember to initiate when I have the time and energy to do that means that I don't see them as often as I would wish, and I really have to make a mental note. But a lot of the people I spend time with are just naturally good initiators, or we see each other frequently enough that the connection happens sort of organically. There's sort of a structure to it. Whereas there are other people I absolutely adore who aren't good initiators, and I'm not a good initiator, and we drift apart. We don't talk very often, just for that reason. And so sometimes people can get their heads really hung up on, I'm always the one asking, and I want them to validate their love for me by being a good initiator and reaching out. And if that's truly important to you, that's fine. But people not initiating can mean a lot of things that have nothing to do with how much they like you. They could just have a full life and be someone who responds. So if you're lonely and you're wanting more connection, cultivating the initiation skill is really, really a great thing to do for yourself. And a willingness to hear no, like part of initiation. Like, I don't love hearing no, but if somebody's not that interested, it's not going to devastate me. It's not the best feeling in the world when I go out on a date with somebody and they don't choose to have a second date, and I would have liked to have had a second date. I don't love that, but the amount of how inconvenient that's going to feel for me is just not super high at this point in my life. I have some resilience around that. So if you feel lacking in those areas, working with a therapist or getting some support around social skills can be a really useful thing, because it's learnable. A lot of times we have a fixed mindset, I'm good with people or I'm not good with people, instead of a growth mindset that says, wow, if I don't have great skills with people, that's learnable. It's something I could master. There are things that work really effectively for having really healthy, functional, joyful relationships. And so rather than treating potential mates or potential friends as a scarcity problem, you want to treat it as a sorting problem and a skill problem. Am I creating enough opportunities to sort through and meet some of the abundance of people that are out in the world? And am I skillful enough to explore whether, a deeper connection would be something that would be nice? And one of the ways, especially in romantic relationships, that I think is hard is when you have a deep dynamic with somebody, you tend to compare not the bad stuff where they're making you miserable, because you would never go out with the person who obviously had the things that caused enormous suffering with your ex as a starting point. You're like, the deal breaker is, so-and-so is addicted to meth, and you meet somebody on a first date who's like, oh yeah, meth and I, we love to hang together. You'd probably walk away before you invested in them, but you compare whatever was good that had you trying to work with them as an alcoholic or a meth addict or somebody who was super passive aggressive or really easily triggered or whatever it was that made the relationship really unsustainable. You compare the good stuff, the rapport, the laughter, the hot sex, the inside jokes, I could tell them anything, like all the really good stuff. And it does take time to build that intimacy with people. And again, I don't think that modern humans really have a sense of that because, again, if you imagine yourself as a child growing up in a hunter-gatherer tribe or growing up in a small agricultural community, you would be knowing all the players from a very young age. This idea of how do I create relationship and connection with a new person probably wasn't something that came up that much in the course of your life, other than like getting to know the new children that were born into the tribe, and either they had an affinity for you or they didn't, but ideally you weren't looking to meet like your adult connection needs with the children. So there's a sense of not really believing that depth and intimacy is something that can be built, and that there's abundance of people, because again, it's just sort of a blind spot where at the level of fact, we have tons of people. And good news, if you're like this complicated, rich, dynamic old soul, those are thick on the ground right now. There are a lot of really old souls, amazing, deep, magical people on the planet. It's an interesting time. Lots of us have come in this time to be part of this incredibly dynamic chapter of change and up-leveling of the vibration and how people treat each other and the technological era. Like all this amazing stuff of the destiny paths of the human race are in play, and lots of really humanitarian old souls, visionary, like just cool people with really magical gifts have come to the planet during this time. And so there's such a neatness to being able to meet them. And when I was younger, I just didn't really trust that. I treated that soul recognition as so precious to me that I would try to work with some really terrible things. And granted, I wasn't as healthy as I am now. So in somebody trying to be friends or a lover with me, they were working with some really terrible things. I'll be honest, if I'm really going into the nitty-gritty, my abandonment issues when I was 22 were so strong that I could be up till 1 a.m. when we both had to be at work the next day, arguing with my boyfriend at the time about something incredibly stupid and trivial, because I didn't want to break the dynamic and be with my own feelings. And it was exhausting and terrible. And we both knew we were nuts. We were both in individual and couples therapy. And eventually it worked out. Eventually our skills got better and we parted ways. And that was a really healthy choice for both of us. But so for sure, healthy enough interpersonal skills are a linchpin of this, because the old way of loyalty to the connection, no matter how miserable it makes you, is a way to be connected to people if you're not doing your inner work and you're not very healthy, because equally unhealthy people can seek each other out. But in other times, as I got more healthy, sometimes one of the arguments I hear, which just kind of makes me cringe, is when someone says, well, yeah, it's really not okay with me that I need monogamy, and he says he'll be monogamous and then he cheats on me, or he's, not available for whatever, thing isn't working. But if I cleaned up my issues, then I would be okay with it. And I'm going to stay with him or her because I don't ever want to do it again. So if I leave this unhealthy dynamic without having worked out my side of it, then I could just recreate it. And I don't want to do that. And that is the total bargaining, rationalization, cognitive bias, crazy thinking, which if you sit down with an actual therapist or with me or with someone, they'll be like, yeah, I've heard that a lot. And what I've found in the people that I've worked with is when you're really healed from it, you just choose not to be in that dynamic, like having a real pain point. Like if you grew up with alcoholic parents and now you have an alcoholic partner and you're like, well, if I just got over my, issues from childhood, I'd be okay with an alcoholic partner. You can heal a little better if somebody isn't pounding on a pain point and making you deal with or not making you, but putting a position together where you're dealing with contemporary suffering. It's just so much easier to heal if you're not hurting over and over again in a tender place. It's much, much easier to heal and grow. So again, once you have more experience, it's easy to start to realize that when you're moving through and meeting new people, how many amazing people are incarnate on the planet and how much rich opportunity there really is for amazing new connections. But one of the things we really have to overcome is the default of our brain is to believe that there are no other potential partners or friends or business partners or jobs or things that we don't already know about, because that was true for our ancestors, but it's not true in the modern era. And sort of overcoming that inaccurate way of mapping the world can give you a lot of opportunity to be really strategic about cultivating the healthy relationships that would really support you, whether we're talking about friendship or romantic relationships. And so I just really wanted to offer this because I think I haven't ever heard anyone else talk about it. And yet I've found within myself and often within my clients the lack of faith that there's anyone with whom they could have this kind of deep, amazing, healthy dynamic when they're having either a lack of people in their lives or when they're trying to make it work in a not very healthy relationship. And we hear people who've gone forward in the territory reporting back, my first marriage was terrible, but then I met this other person and it's really, really wonderful. I never could have imagined. So people who've moved to the other side of that often call back to people who are struggling about how much they've upgraded. But I think before you get there and when you aren't experiencing it, this cognitive bias of not really believing in the abundance of people and not seeing that it's a sorting problem, not a scarcity. Like, how do I sort through all the thousands upon thousands of potential best friends? How do I sort through all the 100,000 of possible lovers in, very small geographic area? If you live in a place with a dense population, that's a different problem than scarcity. And for sure, there are unhealthy people in the world, but I also know that there are an enormous number of amazing, sane, healthy people. So in the meantime, if you invest in your own interpersonal health, the people that you attract and the people you're magnetized to are going to keep going up. So the healthier you are, the healthier of people that you're going to find. And I truly believe whichever side you're on, looking for women or looking for men, there are an enormous number of amazing, healthy, phenomenal people out there if you're healthy enough to and skillful enough to be able to explore those connections. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.